Welcome back to the next stage of the treatment. We've spent the past few days cleaning the embroidery, and that's all finished now. We're very happy with the results. So the next stage that we need to work out is, if we're replacing the restoration fabric with a new fabric, what colour shall that fabric be? The colour that it's on at the moment, it kind of blends in with the original lining fabric, and sometimes people have looked at it and find it quite difficult to distinguish between the original historic lining and the restoration lining. So perhaps the colour that it is now is all a little bit similar. So we're playing around with looking at different coloured backings, and luckily I've got a large collection in our studio of different coloured swatches, and we're really looking at the swatches and having a think of how it influences how the embroidery will look. So we could go really left field and go for a blue or an orangey colour that would pick up some of the embroideries and have that as a background. But I think maybe that might dominate the embroidery too much. But then we're thinking we might go a much paler shade. Hopefully that might bring out some of the colours, make it look a bit brighter, and also make it much clearer what is original and what is the backing. So this is what is original. This is what remains of the embroidery. And you can see very clearly all the areas of loss. And for example, by putting it on a very pale coloured fabric, those areas of loss, they're going to show up more than perhaps they currently stand out. I think that might be quite nice. I think it might be a good way of appreciating the embroidery and really understanding what is original. So we've pretty much narrowed down our choices to these two colours, and what we've done here is just place the swatches underneath a corner where we've unpicked the embroidery so that we can have a much clearer understanding of what it will look like once it's underneath the embroidery. And one of the other things that we have to take into account is that as part of our treatment, that we're going to be putting a very fine transparent netting over the surface of the embroidery and over our new fabric. And because this has got a bit of a colour to it too, that will affect the colour of the ground fabric. But I think that will look fine. So I'd be happy with either of these colours. So the next stage is, having identified a colour, so this colour, we've got a lovely swatch of it, but is now to find the dye recipe for this particular colour. So this is our dye recipe book. That's a collection of all the recipes of the different colours that we've dyed in the studio in the past few years. I'll be able to find the recipe for our swatch. There it is. So that's the colour that we would like to dye. And we can see here that it's a mixture of a yellow, a grey and a brown, and here the different ratios of how much of each of those colours. So the challenge now is to see how accurate this recipe is and whether we can reproduce this colour again by following it.
Dyeing fabric is quite a common activity in textile conservation. We usually use it to dye backing fabric, support fabric, so we often want to dye something a very specific colour, and it's much easier to dye it ourselves. And we know that our fabric, it won't run and it won't be harmful to the object. I'm making samples at the moment so that I can test different combinations of colours before I bulk dye, before I dye our new support fabric. So I'm just going to cut out a sample now, measure that, and that weight will dictate how much dye I use, because it's so specific we have to be very precise. So for dyeing cotton, we use dye powder called solophenol, and as it's in powder form, I'll need to wear a dust mask. So what I'll do is I'll weigh out my powder and then add water to make a stock solution, and from then I'll mix that with the other dye colours to make the specific colour I want. So to make our beige support fabric, I'm going to use 3 main dyes. So this lovely bright orange is in fact a yellow, it comes out yellow, and these colours are very hard to distinguish in their concentrate forms. This one is in fact a grey and this one is a brown. So I'll mix those to specific proportions to get the shade I want. We need to be very precise, so we use these micro pipettes to measure out our dyes to make our mixture. And I'm changing the micro pipette so we don't get any mixing. And finally the brown. And then I'll mix this together and add it to the fabric in the dye bath. And that should give us our beige. Here I've got my cotton samples in with the dye and water, and I'm just heating them up over a period of about 2 hours and stirring them continuously. And I've also added an additive called Glauber salts, also known as anhydrous sodium sulfate. It helps to make sure the colour is consistent and the dye is evenly absorbed. We don't want to see any marks or uneven stains on the fabric when we use it as a support. And this is almost ready to take out and dry, and when it dries it will be quite a different colour. It will be much lighter than it is now.
So one of the main reasons why we want to choose the colour at this stage is because I want to minimise the amount of times we handle and turn the embroidery over. So because the next stage is to turn the embroidery face down so that we can unpick and take off the restoration lining, at that stage I won't be able to see the front, so I won't be able to choose my colour fabric. So this is going to be the last times we see the embroidery on its old backing and face up before we get to the stage where we need the colour.